So I really love history, and my love of history often leads me to cemeteries. And I actually like cemeteries because each monument is leads us to a story. You know, they represent, each monument represents a person and a life lived, and you know, somebody from the past. And it got me thinking recently that about death, and death is typically something that is very, very sad, but it is very much a part of our lives. And every now and again something humorous happens around a passing. Maybe not necessarily to do with the person who died, but just something that happened around it, the people who came or whatever. And I've actually witnessed several things, and then I've had my parents witness things. So I have a group of stories today of that I found humorous, and I'm calling these "Dying Laughing" is the name of today's post. And warning, I don't mean this morbid at all. And two, I have the sense of humor of a 12-year-old boy, which leads me to my first story, which is it's just silly and cute. Okay, so this story is just a silly, humorous story that my cousin told me about one time when she and my aunt took my grandparents to a funeral of someone they knew that had passed. And my family are hillbillies. They come from the Appalachian Mountains of North Georgia, and Ball Ground, Jasper, and so they had made the trek from Atlanta up to the mountains. And after a long car ride, my grandmother was a woman of a certain age. And as she gets out of the car, something happens to her that often happens to women of a certain age. She got the walking toots. And each step made a squeak, and it was not coming from her shoes. And so my cousins are trying to hold on to their laughter and hold on to their composure. And my aunt, my grandfather, and about halfway across the parking lot, they lost it. They started laughing. And I would have laughed too. But anyway, they started laughing. And before long, they're snort laughing. You know how it is when you are not supposed to laugh, that things get suddenly way funnier if you are in a place where you are not supposed to laugh. And they're walking across the parking lot, and they're just snort laughing and getting tickled. And the closer they get to the door, the harder they're trying to regain composure. And they walk in the door, still laughing, still trying to get their composure. And so, of course, everybody stops and turns and looks at them. What are you doing? And so they were, humiliated by their own laughter, but at the same time, it is like the most human thing ever to laugh when you're not supposed to laugh. So my next story, I want to give a little background on my grandfather. I wrote last week about my grandpa and my grandma, Mitchell, and I wrote about my grandma's kitchen. And the background on my grandfather is his name was John, and he started a garage under a shade tree in the yard of basically it was a shack. And he built this business up to a very nice, successful business by the 1980s. And while Grandpa was remember this means something in the story, but while Grandpa was a very fast driver, he had never ever had an accident, ever. Grandpa in the 1950s bought a magnolia tree, and he planted it in the front yard, and that thing grew up to be huge, and it actually still stands, even though the house and the shop have all been demolished to become a parking lot. That tree still stands, and Grandpa planted that tree, and he actually passed away under that tree. He sat down and he passed away under the tree. But when my dad called an ambulance and was following it, a small car pulled straight directly out in front of the ambulance. And the ambulance T-boned the car and flipped over with my passed away grandfather in it. And my dad is sitting here watching it. And I mean, this is horrible. But at the same time, my dad has the same sense of humor I do. Is after all these years and all this time, you've never had a car accident, and you are in a moments after you have passed away and left this life, you are in a catastrophic, horrible accident. Dad said he just kind of had to laugh. And I also told Dad, I said, when I think I've had a bad day, I'm going to remember you and that day, and remember, that was a bad day. That was a bad day. To continue on about this was also going around my grandpa's passing. I had talked to him on Sunday before he passed away and made plans with him. I had a new boyfriend, and I didn't know at that time that boyfriend, he was the only boyfriend I had ever had. I didn't know he was going to become my husband at that moment, but I made plans to bring my boyfriend to meet my grandfather. And unfortunately, we had a good conversation on Sunday, and I was 17 years old. And unfortunately, he passed away on Wednesday. And so the Saturday that we had planned that my new boyfriend would meet my grandfather for the first time, instead, my future mother-in-law and my future husband came to his funeral, which I thought was very sweet. And so I really, they're meeting my entire family. I'm wanting to make a good impression here. I want things to go well. And, and overall it did. It was a nice service and everything. But as we were going down to the graveside service, here comes this girl walking in Daisy Dukes with her hiney hanging out the back, flip-flops, and a Kmart. Y'all remember those elastic Kmart tube tops? She had on a yellow elastic Kmart tube top. Y'all, this is not appropriate funeral attire, okay? I'm all for casual, but this takes it too far. And I was mortified, and I looked around and I said, well, backstory, after my grandmother passed, my grandfather remarried, and she was not a good choice, and he realized that later, but Grandpa never believed in divorce, and in fact, financially provided for her for the rest of her life, and she did live to be into her 90s. But I did not like her, I did not care for her family. So I was like really quickly going, that comes from Louise's family, not mine. These are not Mitchell's. Trying to make sure that they knew that this tube top girl, I had no idea who she was, and I was not related to her in any way, shape, form, or fashion. My next story is one I actually witnessed myself. My cousin's grandmother had passed away, and her grandmother was not my grandmother. You know how it is, you have a cousin, but you don't necessarily share grandmothers. And I went with her to the funeral, and she was not real thrilled with the idea of watching them put her grandmother in the grave at the graveside service. So as soon as it was over with, we kind of backed up a little bit, and as we walked kind of towards the parking lot, and as we're standing there, movement out the corner of my eye caught, and I see a woman crouched behind a tombstone, seemingly talking to nobody. So I kind of elbowed my cousin, and I'm going, do you have any idea what's going on there? And she goes, oh my word, that's my cousin. Oh, that side of the family is horrible. Well, she was crouched down behind it, talking to nothing, and then she was looking around, real paranoid. And then she would sort of run, hide again up against it, looking all paranoid and worried. And this went on for tombstone, playing hide and go seek with nobody. Absolutely nobody. And from what my cousin said, she had a bit of a drug problem, and I guess couldn't handle grief that day. And so I found it humorous. That was the weirdest thing I think I've ever seen at a funeral. At least for me, that was my weirdest thing. I have saved the most bizarre story I know for last. I did not witness this. I was a very little girl. I mean, I do remember hearing about it when it happened. I remember my mom and my aunt sitting together and waiting for news because they'd heard a very good friend was in a dump truck accident where they were pretty sure he was gone way before they were able to get him out of the dump truck. And a horribly sad story. It took hours to get him out, and then I believe that they actually had the visitation at home at this, even in the 80s. I guess sometimes they did that. I myself have never been to a visitation in a home, but I really kind of like the idea. But anyway, the story goes that my parents went, and they were a little late, because my family, we are always a little late, and as they pull up, basically people were making a mass exodus out of every orifice of the building, whether it was I really can't remember if it was the funeral home or their house, but anyway, just drastically people upset, people running, and my dad and my mom and another cousin who is all very confused as what is going on. And my dad, having had a job as a teenager at a funeral home, was not scared to walk inside and try and investigate and see what was wrong. And when he and my cousin and my mom walked inside, there sat their friend straight up in his casket, just sitting there. Apparently, because he had been stuck in a crouched position for so long, rigor mortis had started to set in, and the funeral home did the best they could to straighten him out, but muscle contractions happen sometimes after death, and so in the midst of everybody talking and visiting, he sat up to say hello, sort of, and everybody ran. And they had to call the funeral home and have them fix everything and put him back the way he was. And I'm sure at the time it was not at all funny, but looking back, it is. And really, in closing, the reason I'm doing this sort of is I'm one of the people, I look for humor in life. Life can be really dark and dismal. It can be a dark and dismal place to live. And if we don't look for humor in little places, even in the dark spots, if we don't look for joy, if we don't look for humor, we're going to be a pretty depressed society. And we're not going to make it through. So I really want to know if you have any dying laughing stories of your own, weird stories that happened to you or to your family. I would love to hear them. I think that would be really cool, and I hope nobody finds this morbid, because I don't mean it that way. I have complete respect for everyone, every story, every person that I've spoken about, and I have very much respect for every person who is represented in this cemetery here that lies. And I know that there's not actually people underneath here anymore. Their souls are gone, but I have respect for the legacies they left behind, for the families. And I know in my family, I have a really nice genealogy that led to me and led to the way I raised my family and the way I think and my philosophy on living and homeschooling and marriage and and all of these things. And also, I think a lot of my dad also, he taught me to look for humor in things. Having the sense of humor of a 12-year-old is not always bad, because you can find humor in places where a lot of people wouldn't find it, and it can help you get through the tough times. Goodbye, y'all. See you next Saturday.